When empires stop absorbing pain, everything changes. I do not say this lightly, for I have seen the invisible wars that rage inside the souls of those who, without understanding why, become vessels for the suffering of others. Empathy is not simply kindness, not merely sensitivity to another's plight. It is a mysterious capacity of the psyche, and in its excess it becomes both a gift and a poison. To feel the soul of another as if it were one's own is to touch the collective unconscious, to stand at the boundary where your skin no longer marks the limit of your being. But when the empath forgets the boundary altogether, when the soul has been conditioned by wounds and ancestral burdens to absorb without discernment, then empathy becomes possession. And what is possession if not the most dangerous forgetting of one's own soul? You may wonder why life has placed this burden upon you. Why from your earliest years you sensed the atmosphere in a room before a word was spoken. Why when your parents quarreled, it felt as though the knives were cutting your heart rather than theirs. Why you carried the heaviness of a sibling or even of a stranger on the bus. These are not random accidents of temperament. The psyche, through its hidden laws, chooses the path of certain souls. The empath is often the child who learned early that safety came not from being themselves, but from anticipating the storms of others. Thus they extended their psychic antenna far into the invisible field, tuning themselves to every tremor. What appears to be a gift began as survival. What looks like compassion was born of fear. And what masquerades as holiness may in truth be an ancient wound. But imagine what occurs when that empath begins to awaken, when they recognize that to absorb every shadow is not salvation but self-destruction. Imagine when they stop feeding upon the illusion that they must carry the world's pain in order to be worthy of love. Suddenly the structure of the psyche begins to shift. No longer do they unconsciously merge with the archetype of the sacrificial lamb, the Christ figure who bleeds so that others may live. They begin to recognize that sacrifice without discernment is not divine. It is a betrayal of the soul. For the self, the true center of the psyche, does not demand endless bleeding. The self seeks wholeness, not martyrdom. To stop absorbing pain is not to become cold, indifferent, or narcissistic. Quite the contrary, it is to encounter the deeper mystery of empathy, one that does not drown in the collective, but radiates from the center of one's being. The mystics of old spoke of this in different words. The Buddhists call it compassion without attachment. Christ hinted at it when he said, "Love your neighbor as yourself," implying that love of the self is the foundation of all other love. What use is an empty vessel to a thirsty traveler? And what is left of an empath who has poured themselves out until their very soul runs dry? The change begins in the shadow, for the shadow is not merely the evil we repress, but also the neglected truth of our strength. The empath who absorbs too much is often one who has denied their own anger, their own right to say no, their own boundary as sacred. They see themselves as light bearers, but recoil from the fire of their own will. Yet that very fire is the medicine they need. The unconscious will bring dreams of fire, of burning houses, of erupting volcanoes, not to frighten them, but to remind them of the energy they have buried. If you dream of drowning in a flood, know that your unconscious is showing you what happens when you absorb the waters of others without building a dam of discernment. If you dream of being consumed by a crowd, know that the psyche is warning you of the dissolution of your individuality in the face of the collective. These dreams are not punishments. They are instructions. When the empath begins to listen, truly listen, they hear the voice of the self whispering. You were not created to be a sponge for the world's despair. You were created to be a mirror of divine wholeness. The archetype of the healer must evolve first. The wounded healer takes in the pain of others because they themselves are wounded. Then through awareness, the healer recognizes that they must transmute their wound, not multiply it. Finally, the true healer learns that they do not heal by absorbing, but by standing firm in their own being, radiating presence, allowing others to encounter their own shadows in that mirror. This is why everything changes, because the empath is no longer enslaved to the unconscious contract of carrying everyone else's pain as proof of their existence. I have seen what happens when the empaths resist this transformation. They fall into depression, exhaustion, even physical illness. The body becomes the battlefield upon which unprocessed energies clash. Autoimmune diseases, chronic fatigue, inexplicable pains. Often these are the signs of a psyche overwhelmed by what it has taken in but cannot digest. The soul rebels when it is treated as a waste basket for the world. Do not mistake this rebellion for weakness. It is the self attempting to reclaim its rightful place. It is the psyche saying enough. But when the empath surrenders to the deeper law, when they no longer define themselves by how much they can carry, but by how authentically they can live, then the transformation is radical. The same sensitivity that once enslaved them becomes a compass for truth. They no longer enter a room and drown in the emotions of others. They enter a room and immediately discern what belongs to them and what does not. They begin to see archetypes at play: the tyrant, the victim, the seducer, the trickster. And instead of becoming their prey, they become witnesses to the eternal drama. And from the position of witness, true power emerges. They no longer live as the silent absorbers of storms, but as the calm eye within them. When an empath stops absorbing pain, they begin to anchor themselves in an identity beyond the wounded child who was trained to survive through attunement. They become an adult soul, aligned not with endless sacrifice, but with the archetype of the sovereign. And sovereignty is not isolation. It is not coldness. It is the capacity to hold your own essence intact while walking among the chaos of others. This is why boundaries become sacred rather than shameful. For too long, empaths have believed that saying no is cruelty, that distancing themselves is abandonment, that choosing themselves is selfishness. Yet the psyche knows otherwise. A boundary is not a wall of rejection. It is the recognition that love without self-respect is not love, but annihilation. A boundary is the circle of fire that keeps your soul alive so that your presence itself can be medicine. Without this, empathy decays into codependency, love twists into control, and compassion rots into resentment. The shift is subtle at first. The empath notices they can walk into the grief of another and no longer drown. They can listen to rage without it piercing their heart like a blade. They can sense the despair of a loved one and know in the deepest chambers of their being that not all of it belongs to them. This knowing is liberation, and in that liberation their energy returns, creativity blossoms, desire awakens. The soul, once suffocated by other people's storms, begins to breathe again. And yet, this liberation is not without resistance. Others will not understand. Those who relied upon the empath's endless availability may feel betrayed, abandoned, even angry. The world that has grown accustomed to taking their energy will accuse them of being cold or distant. But the empath must see through this illusion. What the world calls coldness is in truth wholeness. What the world calls selfishness is in truth authenticity. What the world calls distance is in truth sacred space for transformation. If you are an empath standing at this threshold, know this: the world does not need you to bleed endlessly. The world needs you whole. The collective unconscious does not ask you to drown in its darkness. It asks you to stand firm as a light so that others may find their way through their own shadows. You are not abandoning them when you stop absorbing. You are empowering them. For if you carry their pain forever, they will never encounter their own soul. But if you stand as a sovereign being, they will be forced to meet their reflection. This is why everything changes. The empath who stops absorbing pain no longer identifies with the archetype of the victim or the savior. They embody the archetype of the integrated self. Their compassion flows, but it is not destructive. Their love radiates, but it is not self-erasing. Their presence heals, not because they take the wound into themselves, but because they illuminate the truth in others. This is the final mystery: empathy without absorption, compassion without martyrdom, love without annihilation. The empath who reaches this point begins to sense a strange new freedom, almost unsettling at first, because the body and soul have grown so accustomed to carrying weight that its absence feels unfamiliar. It is like a prisoner stepping into sunlight after years in a cell. The warmth feels almost unbearable until the skin remembers what freedom is. This is how the empath feels when they stop absorbing pain. The nervous system, once braced for every emotional storm, begins to soften. Muscles unclench, breathing deepens. For the first time, silence feels like sanctuary rather than emptiness. And in that silence, the voice of the self is heard more clearly than ever before. It whispers, you were never meant to be consumed. You were meant to create, and creation begins to flow. The empath discovers energy for art, for love, for vision, for purpose. What was once drained into the black hole of endless absorption now becomes fuel for life. The empath writes again, paints again, dreams again. They begin to live not as a reaction to other people's wounds, but as an expression of their own essence. And this essence, when fully embraced, is the greatest gift they can offer the world. Relationships begin to transform. Those built upon silent sacrifice may fall away because the empath no longer plays the role of savior or emotional sponge. At first, this can feel like loss, but it is in truth a rebirth, for the relationships that remain and the ones that emerge are built upon mutual respect, mutual presence, and authenticity. The empath no longer gives to be loved. They are loved because they exist as themselves. That shift is profound. It is the end of conditional belonging and the beginning of true connection. Even the way they perceive suffering changes. Where once they absorbed it blindly, now they witness it with clarity. They understand that pain is not always theirs to carry, but sometimes theirs to simply witness, to hold space for, to honor. They do not run from it, but neither do they drown in it. This balance is the hallmark of maturity in the empathic soul. It is no longer the compulsive reaction of the wounded child. It is the conscious choice of the awakened being. And here lies the paradox. By no longer absorbing the world's pain, they actually become more effective agents of healing. Their presence no longer drains them or others. It awakens others. When they stand in their sovereignty, people around them begin to sense their own capacity for sovereignty. Healing is contagious, not because the empath takes away another's suffering, but because they embody the possibility of wholeness. They become living proof that one can be sensitive without being consumed, compassionate without being destroyed, open without being emptied. This is why everything changes when the empath stops absorbing pain. They no longer live at the mercy of the collective unconscious, tossed around by the moods and wounds of others. Instead, they become a conscious participant in the great drama of life, rooted in their center, radiating outward rather than collapsing inward. They begin to experience life not as a series of storms to endure, but as a sacred journey to embody. And perhaps for the first time, they understand what it means to be free. Freedom for the empath does not mean the absence of feeling. It means the presence of choice. Where once every vibration, every sorrow, every flicker of another's suffering seeped into their bones without permission, now they choose what to let in and what to release. They stand as guardians at the gate of their own soul, no longer passive receivers, but conscious keepers. And with this choice comes strength, a strength that does not roar with aggression, but hums with quiet certainty. It is the strength of knowing I am not here to drown with you, but I can stand beside you while you learn to swim. This new way of being brings with it a kind of spiritual authority. Others sense it instinctively, even if they cannot name it. They feel calmer in the presence of one who has stopped absorbing, for that presence is no longer frantic or depleted, but steady, grounded, luminous. The empath becomes like a lighthouse, anchored, unshaken by storms, yet radiating light that guides others safely home. And unlike before, This light does not cost them their life force. It flows naturally, effortlessly, because it comes from alignment rather than sacrifice. The empath also begins to discover a different relationship with power. For so long, they have associated power with domination, cruelty, or the harshness they have witnessed in others. They feared becoming powerful, for they thought it meant becoming unkind. But when they stop absorbing pain, they realize that true power is not about control. It is about presence. It is about knowing who you are and standing in that truth without apology. They see that compassion rooted in selfhood is more powerful than any act of martyrdom. They learn that to embody their own light fully is the greatest service they can render. And in this realization, an old pattern begins to die. The empath no longer attracts only those who seek to unload, to take, to drain. Instead, they begin to draw in souls who meet them at eye level, who honor their boundaries, who resonate with their wholeness. It is as though the energy they once broadcast, "I will carry you at my own expense," has been replaced by a new frequency, "I will stand with you, but I will not abandon myself." This change alters everything. Life, once a cycle of exhaustion and disappointment, becomes a field of reciprocity and growth. The world will always have pain, but the empath's role within it evolves. They are no longer the silent sink into which sorrow endlessly pours. They are alchemists now, transforming presence into healing energy without losing themselves in the process. They can stand in the midst of grief, injustice, and rage, and instead of collapsing, they radiate clarity. They become a reminder that light and shadow can coexist, that sensitivity can be strength, and that love does not require self-destruction. And so, when the empath stops absorbing pain, they do not stop being empathic, they begin being truly empathic. For the first time, empathy is not a survival strategy or a wound in disguise. It is the conscious embrace of life in its fullness, lived from the center of one's own soul. This is the moment of transformation. This is the moment of freedom. This is the moment where the empath, no longer chained to the suffering of the world, steps into their true power, and in doing so, becomes the healing they were always seeking to be. When the empath embraces this freedom fully, life itself begins to reveal new textures. Colors seem sharper, sounds more vibrant. Even the air carries a different weight. Because when you are no longer buried beneath the heaviness of everyone else's sorrow, you begin to actually experience the rawness of your own existence. Joy feels richer, not tinged with guilt. Rest feels nourishing, not stolen. Love feels expansive, not transactional. It is as though a veil is lifted, and the empath sees life not through the haze of borrowed suffering, but through the brilliance of their own clear vision. This clarity changes how they walk in the world, where once they tiptoed carefully, terrified of disturbing the emotions of others. Now they walk with steady steps, unapologetic yet graceful. Their words no longer bend to avoid conflict, but carry the weight of authenticity. Their silence is no longer suffocating, but sacred, a silence that heals, because it is rooted in presence, not avoidance. Even their smallest gestures, the way they listen, the way they breathe, the way they simply exist, become infused with a quiet power that others can feel, but cannot always explain. And then something extraordinary begins to happen. The empath, who no longer absorbs pain, starts to inspire others to stop outsourcing their healing. People who once leaned heavily on them begin to sense that they, too, can face their own shadows. It is as though the empath's very existence becomes a mirror, showing others the possibility of sovereignty, of living without collapsing into victimhood or dependency. This ripple effect is perhaps the greatest gift of all, because it does not just heal one empath. It awakens a community, a family, a generation. But the path is not without challenge. To stop absorbing is not a one-time act, but a continuous practice. The old reflexes return. Moments when the empath feels the pull to merge with someone else's despair, to carry it as their own. Yet each time, awareness sharpens. Each time, they choose differently. And with every choice, their soul grows stronger. Boundaries become second nature, not walls of fear, but rivers guiding the flow of energy. They learn when to open and when to close, when to listen deeply, and when to step back, when to give and when to rest. This rhythm becomes their dance with life, a dance of balance with harmony and truth. What changes is not just the empath, but the very story they tell themselves about who they are. No longer are they the fragile soul cursed to carry the world's sorrow. No longer are they the victim of sensitivity. They are the alchemist of emotion, the sovereign of their inner world, the mirror of divine wholeness. They know now that to be empathic is not to suffer endlessly, but to live with fierce tenderness, guided by discernment, rooted in selfhood, and radiant with love. And so, as the empath steps deeper into this new way of being, there comes a profound realization, one that reshapes not only how they relate to others, but how they relate to themselves. They begin to see that their sensitivity was never a curse, never a flaw to be hidden or a burden to be carried. It was always a doorway, an initiation into a different way of experiencing life. Yet without boundaries, without self-awareness, it became distorted, twisted into endless sacrifice. Now, with awakening, that same sensitivity transforms into wisdom, into power, into presence. The empath who once dissolved in the suffering of others now becomes the one who teaches, not always through words, but through example. Their very life begins to whisper, "You can feel deeply and still remain whole." And that whisper becomes a song, a resonance that others unconsciously recognize. People around them begin to notice their steadiness, their clarity, their refusal to collapse. Some resist it, clinging to the old ways, but others are drawn to it like moths to flame. Not because they want to drain it, but because they want to remember that such freedom is possible for themselves. The empath also discovers something unexpected, a new relationship with solitude. Where once being alone felt heavy, even frightening, now it becomes a sanctuary. Solitude is no longer emptiness, it is fullness. In solitude, the empath reconnects with their own soul, not as a mirror of others, but as a source of light in itself. They learn to enjoy the stillness, the quiet heartbeat of their own presence. And from this wellspring, they gather strength, creativity, and inspiration. They are no longer afraid of their own company because they finally understand they are enough. And when they re-enter the world from this place of wholeness, they bring with them a different kind of energy. An energy that uplifts without depleting, that comforts without consuming, that loves without erasing the self. This is what it means to embody compassion from the center rather than from the wound. This is the deeper calling of the empath, not to be a vessel of suffering, but to be a beacon of truth. Everything changes because the empath finally understands that the most radical act of love is not to carry what is not theirs, it is to live fully as who they truly are. And in doing so, they remind the world that love is not measured by how much you sacrifice, but by how authentically you shine. And when the empath finally embodies this truth, there is no going back. They feel it in their bones, in the quiet rhythm of their heartbeat, in the way their soul now expands instead of contracts. The world has not changed. Pain still exists, people still suffer, storms still rage, but their relationship to it has changed entirely. They are no longer the silent container for everyone else's wounds. They are the living proof that sensitivity, when anchored in selfhood, becomes strength. And here is the paradox that life reveals in this transformation. By refusing to carry what is not theirs, the empath actually brings more healing into the world. They stop perpetuating cycles of dependency and start inspiring cycles of awakening. Their presence tells others, "I will not drown with you, but I will walk beside you until you remember you can swim." And in that walking, in that witnessing, others begin to reclaim their own power. The empath becomes not a savior, but a catalyst, not a sacrifice, but a spark. This is why everything changes, because the empath is no longer drained. They begin to live their purpose with clarity. They write, they build, they create, they love, not from depletion, but from overflow. Their life ceases to be a reaction to others' storms and becomes a declaration of their own light. They are no longer defined by what they endure, but by what they embody. And what they embody is wholeness. And perhaps this is the great secret. The empath's true gift was never in absorbing pain, it was in transforming presence. It was in standing so rooted, so authentically themselves, that others are invited into their own authenticity. This is the legacy of the awakened empath. This is the freedom that ripples outward, touching families, communities, and generations. And so, when the empath no longer bends beneath the weight of borrowed suffering, when they finally reclaim the right to live as their whole self, they become something extraordinary. They become the proof that love does not require self-erasure, that compassion does not demand crucifixion, that sensitivity is not a weakness, but a doorway to the sacred. They are the ones who show us that to feel deeply is not to drown, but to discover an ocean vast enough to hold both light and shadow without losing its horizon. In their presence, others begin to awaken. Not because the empath has taken their pain, but because the empath reflects back to them their own hidden strength. They no longer say, "Give me your burden, and I will carry it." Instead, their life says, "Stand with me in your truth, and you will see that you are stronger than you believed." This is a love that liberates, not a love that enslaves. This is empathy matured into wisdom. And in that wisdom, everything changes. For the empath has not abandoned the world. They have learned how to love it more fiercely, more truthfully, more sustainably. They no longer walk as shadows of sacrifice. They walk as sovereign souls, carrying their own light. And the world, aching for authenticity, hungering for truth, begins to remember through them that freedom is not found in absorption, but in presence. And as the empath stands in this new light, there is a calmness about them that cannot be shaken. It is not arrogance, not withdrawal, but a quiet certainty that says, "I know who I am, and I will not lose myself again." The storms may rise, the cries of others may echo, but the empath no longer dissolves in them. Instead, they hold steady, rooted like an ancient tree whose branches sway, yet whose trunk remains unbroken. They have learned that the world's pain is real, but it is not their destiny to swallow it whole. In this steadiness, they discover a kind of joy they had forgotten was possible. Joy not stolen in brief moments between exhaustion, but joy as a constant hum beneath their days. They laugh more freely, they rest more deeply, they love without fear of disappearing. For the first time, their empathy nourishes them instead of draining them. It becomes a river that flows both inward and outward, sustaining their own soul as it touches others. And slowly, life begins to reshape itself around this new energy. Work feels more purposeful, relationships more balanced, solitude more sacred. Even challenges appear different, not as crushing waves, but as invitations to grow stronger. The empath no longer dreads what tomorrow will bring because they know they are no longer at the mercy of every passing storm. They carry within them a center, a sanctuary, a fire that cannot be extinguished. This is the transformation that changes everything. The empath who once felt cursed now sees their gift clearly. They were never here to be a sponge. They were here to be a mirror, a reminder, a lighthouse. And now they shine. Not because they carry the world's pain, but because they finally carry themselves. And so, the empath who once lived bent beneath the unseen weight of countless sorrows begins to walk upright, breathing fully for the first time. They realize that the gift was never about emptying themselves for others. It was about learning how to remain whole while still caring deeply. This realization alters the very rhythm of their life. No longer do they wake each day already weary from the burdens they cannot name. They rise with a different kind of energy, one that is not borrowed, not stolen, but born from within. The world still comes to them, still spills its grief, still reaches for their light. But now the empath listens differently. They no longer confuse compassion with self-sacrifice. They no longer measure love by how much of themselves they can lose. They know now that love rooted in self-erasure only deepens wounds, while love rooted in truth awakens healing. And so they hold space instead of holding weight. They witness without drowning. They offer presence without depletion. This shift is radical, yet it unfolds with quiet grace. And those around them feel it. Family members notice they no longer collapse under pressure. Friends notice they no longer rush to fix what is broken, but instead inspire others to face their own shadows. Strangers notice the calm in their eyes, the steadiness in their voice. Something about them has changed, though it cannot always be named. What has changed is everything. Because when the empath finally stops absorbing pain, they begin to embody wholeness. And in a world starving for authenticity, this wholeness is medicine. It ripples outward, touching lives not by carrying their suffering, but by reminding them that they too can stand whole. The empath becomes living proof that sensitivity is not a weakness. It is a sacred power when wielded with wisdom. And so the empath's story is rewritten, no longer the endless sacrifice, no longer the silent martyr, no longer the forgotten vessel of everyone else's wounds. They are now the sovereign soul, the one who loves without losing themselves, the one who walks with compassion and with strength, the one who finally understands that their light was never meant to be dimmed by the shadows of others. It was meant to shine fiercely and freely for all to see. And as the empath embraces this rebirth, something miraculous begins to happen. They no longer see themselves as broken for feeling too much. Instead, they honor the depth of their emotions as the very thing that connects them to the heartbeat of humanity. The tears they once hid now become sacred waters of truth. The joy they once suppressed now becomes laughter that heals. Every sensation, every intuition, every stirring of the soul, what once felt like a curse now becomes their compass. Life, once heavy with silent burdens, becomes alive with possibility. The empath begins to create, to dream, to live fully in their own skin. They learn the rhythm of boundaries, the melody of saying no without guilt, and the harmony of saying yes to themselves. Their relationships shift, no longer built on quiet sacrifice, but on mutual respect and real connection. And while some drift away, unable to face this new version of them, those who remain are the ones who truly see their worth. This is the gift of choosing oneself. It is not selfishness, it is salvation. It is remembering that to love others well, one must first love oneself fiercely. And in that fierce love, the empath discovers freedom. Freedom from the roles that kept them small. Freedom from the guilt that chained their soul. Freedom from the endless cycle of giving until there was nothing left. They walk now with a quiet power, a power that does not seek to dominate, but to radiate, a power that does not rescue others by losing themselves, but instead inspires others to rise alongside them. They become the mirror that reflects back to the world what wholeness looks like. And in this, the empath's final lesson unfolds. Their sensitivity was never meant to break them, it was meant to awaken them, to remind them, and all of us, that the deepest strength is not in how much we can endure, but in how fully we can live.